Welcome to the Bill Walton Show, featuring conversations with leaders, entrepreneurs, artists, and thinkers. Fresh perspectives on money, culture, politics, and human flourishing. Interesting people, interesting things.
Business people Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Sam Walton, Martha Stewart, Jeff Bezos, and other entrepreneurs like them have created far more value for society than any of the thousands of politicians put together who are telling us they can make our lives better. Think about it. Can you name a government program that has brought us more delight and usefulness than the iPhone? Or more ease of shopping than Amazon? Innovative businesses bring us never-before imagined products and services, create most of the new jobs in our economy, and are the most important forces driving growth and expanding human welfare. A continuing stream of new enterprises is critical to society's growth and advancement. So it is vital that we understand the essential role these businesses play. Is there a formula for success? Are there women or men who are born to be entrepreneurs, or could every person do it? With me to explore these issues is Carl Schramm, whose recent book, Burn the Business Plan, opens with the statement, how real practical information can help entrepreneurs. Carl ran the Kauffman Foundation, a $2 billion endowment dedicated to promoting entrepreneurship, and Kauffman was the first to inject intellectual empirical rigor into research about how new firms are created. Carl has started companies, managed small and large organizations, been a venture investor, consulted with big firms and governments on innovation throughout the world. Welcome, Carl.
Good to see you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Carl, you said that entrepreneurs are too valuable a natural resource to be subjected to a potpourri of unsubstantiated aphorisms dressed up as good business advice. Carl, let's start there.
It's a great place to start. In a sense, the reason I wrote this book was having run the Kauffman Foundation for 10 years and having seen the potpourri of books and advice and courses that people have laid in front of people who would be entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs. I just became so frustrated that these books basically pass along mythology. And I think what marked my 10 years at Kauffman, as you said in the introduction, I was really focused on trying to get to the empirics of what happens, okay? So before we began our research, I'm happy to say we do this now, we count this in the government, but if you can imagine, in 2002, when I went to Kauffman, there was no federal statistic that told us how many new businesses were being started in the United States. And as your introduction properly said, it's these new businesses that fire up or regenerate or refresh, whatever way you want to look at it, our economy. And to imagine that economists had no interest in this, not enough to have pushed the government measuring startups, seemed, difficult for me to comprehend. And in a sense, what I saw was, it's business professors who tell stories, but they don't have a systematic view that would be helpful to somebody who's thinking about starting a business. There's a lot of aspiration out there. Certainly now with the hype about entrepreneurs, people think, oh, this is what I want to do. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do in the book is basically say, look, before you take that first step, understand how this process works. Yeah. There's a magic cookbook, okay? This is real statistical facts. One of the very first things you might point out is, colleges are loaded up with this view that we're going to teach every graduate and that the idealized entrepreneur is 21. But in truth, the average entrepreneur in the United States starts his or her first business when they're 39.
Yeah, you burst the bubble completely on the idea that it's usually, a 19-year-old kid who dropped out of Harvard who started something in his dorm room. And in fact, that's by far the exception rather than the rule. I mean, most of the entrepreneurs you point out are middle-aged and they've been in businesses, they've worked for other people, they've got a lot of scars on their back before they launch their own their own venture, and you know, we have and I'm glad it is romanticized because it does shine a spotlight on entrepreneurship. But it's not everybody is Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. It's what you call in the book everyman.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a book for every man entrepreneur, in the sense that, almost 95% of people who start businesses are what a famous economist once called replicative. They're copycat entrepreneurs, right? So the notion that you're going to be Mark Zuckerberg, there are Mark Zuckerbergs happen. We have a special word for it. We now call them unicorns. Years ago, we used to call them gazelles, okay? So I don't know which animal is appropriate, but the fact is that's a tiny, tiny fraction. And the sort of structure of your career, if you're like a 19-year-old in college, that you're going to learn how to be an entrepreneur, you're going to take a major in that. Becoming an entrepreneur is like an occupation, like becoming a dentist or an accountant. It's just so unreal. Going back to the point you made earlier, I wrote the book to disturb this, mostly to save people from wasting a huge amount of time pursuing a fantasy that we don't actually have sketched out for everybody in kind of a cookbook way.
Well, I think you were part of the work that developed the knowledge that where the really great jobs come from. And you mentioned gazelles, and now we call them unicorns. But gazelles are basically those high growth, tend to be technology oriented companies, but it doesn't have to be technology. But those growth companies that in the old days went public were the gazelles, and that's where the action is in terms of high paying jobs. And then now we have the unicorns, and I guess the only basic difference there is they don't go public anymore because of the state of the public markets.
Yeah, there are a couple of issues surrounding that are kind of interesting. One is that a lot of these gazelles or unicorns don't, in the end, create that many jobs. If you really think about it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that was the.
No. I mean, that's not the companies that do it. It's the folks who actually start, a franchise. It comes to mind, there's a fellow in the book called Bob Carlucci. And, he has a fantastic story. His father died. He had to drop out of college. He was at the New England Conservatory. He was going to become a musician. He got a part-time job in a pool room, and he bought 2 cigarette vending machines. His full-time job, he was working night shifts at General Electric up in around Boston, because he's supporting his mother and 3 younger brothers. But it's those 2 vending machines that sort of got him started. And the next thing you know, he tried to get a franchise, Taco Bell in Boston. People said tacos. They didn't.
Tacos, yeah.
Taco was not eaten in Boston. People sort of forget this, and Bob's not that old. But he finally got Taco Bell to give him a franchise in Maryland. And long story short, he now employs 16,000 people. So the issue is with some of the high-tech companies, the core at Google that really manages the search engine is something on the order of 35 to 60 people. So if you strip away everything else, that's the core of Google. Facebook doesn't employ that many people. So there is this kind of shift in the weather. Entrepreneurs are still really vital to the creation of new businesses, but it's not necessarily the gazelles. We estimated at Kaufman, first time these estimates were ever done, Bill, if you can imagine this, that about 80 to 85% of all the new jobs in the United States are created in firms less than 5 years old. That's how important they are to job creation.
Okay, I think that was the statistic I was thinking about. And you also point out that we talk about franchises, roughly 40-45% of the new businesses created every year are franchises.
Yeah. Yeah. And if today we were just translating ourselves to you name the business school, right? You won't find a course on franchising because professors think about franchisees. They can't bring themselves to believe that they're entrepreneurs, right? But let me say, you or I go out tomorrow, we're lucky enough to get a Chick-fil-A franchise, right? You'll know what it feels like to be an entrepreneur. You've left your job. You've taken loans to buy the franchise. You know, you got the mortgage on the building. You've dealt with a contractor. You know what the city requires in terms of rent for your parking lot, right? You've become an entrepreneur. And one of the most amazing things about this is exactly Bob Carlucci's story. You know, he starts with one franchise, and then the next thing you know, he had 60 restaurants with 16,000 employees. And part of that is the same reason that we watch success go up with age. You know, once he ran one franchise, he sort of knew what the ropes were, right? And then adding the second, third, fourth, 16th were much easier. He was a scale entrepreneur, if you will.
Well, I think when I ran Allied Capital, when I was CEO of Allied Capital, we owned several franchisors, Meineke and some building cleaning franchisors, and also helped finance the franchisees. And yeah, that's right. I mean, we created, hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs through these franchisee operations. And I think you're right. They're lying awake at 2 a.m. worrying about stuff the same way every Silicon Valley entrepreneur is worrying about stuff. I mean, taking responsibility for an enterprise, large or small, is a very big deal. And it brings me to the question, who is an entrepreneur? Are they made? Are they born? Can anybody be an entrepreneur? What are the barriers? One of the things you point out that it's certainly not college. Most of the people who start businesses didn't even go to college. And so what is that thing we call the entrepreneur?
Well, I got like 3 answers. The first is most entrepreneurs who start their businesses, if it's not a franchise, right? If you ask them, it's amazing how consistent the answer is. They were surprised. They surprised themselves that they're an entrepreneur because they were working in early middle age. They're working in a factory. They saw how something could have been done better. Maybe they've talked to their boss in the company about these improvements. You know, companies don't like to make changes in things. So these are guys who left. There's a huge amount of people who basically are called spin-out entrepreneurs in my book.
Well, isn't that how Sam Walton started Walmart? He was working with Woolworth or one of the other big chains and said, look, I've got an idea that we can serve these rural communities with low-cost goods and it'll be a real winner. And they said, no, that's not our business. I mean, you've been looking at this for a long time. Is there a single characteristic of a person that decides I'm going to be an entrepreneur, or is it a mosaic?
Yeah, it's a mosaic. I never found it. You know, there are a lot of professors who say, "Oh, I can smell them." Right? It's their personality. They're great salespeople. They're, you know, I've known thousands at this point in my life. If you run the Kauffman Foundation, it's a constant parade, and some extremely successful. I have people in mind who have the mousiest personalities, and they run huge international companies. Yeah. Right? Other people are boisterous. Right? They're, you know, some people say, well, most of them get divorced. There's just no statistics on this. There's all this sort of mythology about it. And I think, you know, one of the things that I do see constantly is people who were surprised, right, as I was when I first started my first business, right? Other people have an aspiration to work for themselves. Yeah. Okay. In some cases, they got to settle a score. That's the case with Mr. Kauffman, okay? He was tremendously successful as a salesman. And 2 years in a row, the guy who owned the company cut his sales territory because he made more under the commission formula than the president of the company. And the second time he did it, Mr. Kauffman said, I quit, and went out and figured out how to start a business because he had these words in his head: I will never work for somebody else in my life.
Well, that happened to Walt Disney. Walt Disney created a cartoon character, Oswald the something. Yeah. I can't remember what the creature was. Very successful, and his syndicator was in New York.
Yeah.
And he traveled to New York expecting to cut a new contract, and the distributor said, well, I've decided it's so successful, you don't need to make as much money, so I'm going to cut you by 80%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he said, okay. I'm going to get on the train, I'm going to go back to California, and by the time I'm in California, I'm going to have a new creature, and that new creature was Mickey Mouse.
So we could put Walt Disney, who's also from Kansas City, and Ewing Kauffman from Kansas City in the same box. I'm going to settle a score, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What they're really saying is, A, I have a lot of confidence in my idea to do something. Second, the best boss I'm ever going to have is me, okay? And somehow in there is the third thing that people often fixate on, but you can't measure it. And that is, those two forces are such that they're ready to take a risk, okay? And bet on themselves, okay? That they could somehow feed the family for a couple of years and go to town and make a company. And if there's something that's elusive, that seems to be a part of entrepreneurs, okay? But it's not everybody. Everybody says, well, Mark Zuckerberg, his parents, look at Bill Gates. His father's very successful. These are not folks who, if they stumbled, they were going to be on welfare.
Well, it strikes me there may be another attribute at work, which is you point out the entrepreneur's journey is essentially that of self-education.
Yes.
And that we'll get into the business plan or the need for or not. But it's essentially you get into a business and it's a discovery procedure where you're learning about yourself and you're learning about what works and what doesn't work. And you also talk about something in the book called the OODA loop, which is where I guess it was initiated to a great deal with fighter pilots in the Korean War. And, an entrepreneur never really knows, but you're trying to discover all the time what works. And that's an attribute. And I think most successful entrepreneurs share that attribute, whether they're tall, short, fat, small,
Right.
black, white, or brown.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, the essence of the book is distilled into one sentence, and it came from Ewing Kauffman, and I repeat it again and again, and that is, the only way to learn how to be an entrepreneur is to start a business.
Right.
And the point you were making is, in the course of starting that business, you begin to teach yourself a huge amount about yourself, as well as learn an entirely new business. At the moment, I happen to be at J-Labs in New York City, looking at a company in which
J-Labs is Johnson & Johnson?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an accelerator that they run here in New York, and they have 4 or 5 other installations around the country. And I'm here visiting with a fabulous entrepreneur in whom I have a small investment. And this is really the 3rd iteration of her company. I've been in this company as an investor probably 7 or 8 years. She had to reinvent it once, reinvent it twice, and now she's on a trailblazing path to growth. But, as an investor, I learned a lot one more time that, first of all, businesses aren't great successes in 1 or 2 years like college professors like to tell kids.
Yeah.
The average, as I say in my book, it's statistical, it's empirical. It's going to take you 7 or 8 years before you actually know whether or not the business is going to survive. And, when we think about these unicorns and stuff, if you actually look at the average time from the start to the day investors and the public would invest in them, if they go public, it's like 13 years.
Well, there are a couple things that you and I, many more than a couple of things, but one of the things is that we know an awful lot about what doesn't work. And we talk about universities teaching entrepreneurship. I think you point out that in 1980 we had maybe 10 professors of entrepreneurship around the country. I happen to know one of them, is a guy named Bill Haberly at Indiana University, who was typified by, he wore an orange jumpsuit the whole time, and I think this was before before prison guards used, or the prisoners had that. But he was quite a character. But he stood out as being different from everybody else, and he wasn't really part of the crew. But business schools, business plans, incubators, accelerators, mentors, you get into all this in the book. Yeah.
It's, professors with time on their hands, and they're not really sure they can make anything happen. I mean, very few university programs can say, let me point to our 15 gazelles or our unicorns or our great successes, right? And if you point at them, it's not clear it happened. What is Harvard responsible for in Facebook, right? They take in a so-so looking kid who wants dates. That Harvard contributed to that? I don't think so. They gave him a dorm room, Later, by the way, Harvard being Harvard, at one point had a prohibition on running businesses in dorm rooms, if you can believe it, okay? So if these successes were happening, they worked very hard not to have more of them. Okay. Okay. But anyway, but you know, professors being professors, one bad idea should follow another bad idea. So, you know, now we have this ecosystem because people look at the Silicon Valley and they say, there's no, people weren't taking formal courses. What's in the water out there, right? Well, they had mentors, right? And they all had little garages. So maybe we could build kind of like a big garage and we'll call it an incubator. And then being entrepreneurial, incubators sort of got tired. So we call them accelerators, right? And then we'll have
incubators were too slow, so we're going to accelerate. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, just another statistic. Okay, we have now about 1,400 incubators around America.
Yeah.
Every time you get a city that's failing, right? So I won't mention any, but think of any major city in the Northeast, right? They're not as big as they used to be. Okay. Well, Detroit, say, you know, Detroit had 2 million people once. It's got 700,000, and now it's got about 8 incubators. Okay, because entrepreneurs are going to save Detroit. But if you look at the 1,400 incubators, they're now about 10 years old on average. Over half of them never had a company that has survived to 5 years. Right. Nevertheless, it looks as if we do this, maybe we can make Silicon Valley happen right here in Elmira, New York.
Well, this is the place you need to tell your cargo cult story, because you know we've got this ritual where you know we're gonna sprinkle some things into Peoria, and it's going to be we're going to have an incubator, and we're going to have mentors, we're going to have accelerators, and all these things that are garages. We're going to have garages in Peoria too. Yeah. Tell the cargo cult story.
I've actually been in incubators where they have a garage in the middle of the room, you know, just in case nobody gets the formula, right? Anyway, the cargo cult story is actually one told, I found it again in Richard Feynman's book, you know, the great physicist at Caltech. And essentially what it boils down to is a story anthropologists tell. We had, in the course of the war in the Pacific in World War II, we developed a South Seas island with an Air Force base. And when Americans got there, you know, the Aboriginal people got addicted to the inflights of all the food and candy bars, and cigarettes, and all that stuff. And there was an air base, right? And then we withdrew quickly as the war moved closer and closer to Japan. But after the war in the 1950s, somebody visited, and people were going through the rituals of keeping the control tower. They had people in the control tower. They were fooling around with broken instruments. Somehow, it was a very, very remote island, very Aboriginal people, didn't understand anything. But the cult was, they had a religious cult that they did all the things, right? And they marched around with sticks like soldiers doing drills, that somehow the gods who brought candy bars and cargo to them would return someday, right? And I use that because it's sort of the same thing. Like, these seem to be the things that work in the Silicon Valley, right? So if we go through those motions, you know, we can make Elmira look like, you know, this is Palo Alto. Well, no, you know, just like once upon a time, Cleveland was a bubbling St. Louis, huge Chicago railroad city. Yeah. That's their essence, right? But when airplanes came, their future was going to be different.
Well, but at this point, I think you mentioned Silicon Valley, and the probabilities of success. I think it's fair at this point to talk about what the track record is in Silicon Valley in terms of if they invest in 10 companies, what's the track record?
Yeah, well, I know this personally because I'm an investor through some funds in the Silicon Valley, right? Yeah. And they're very famous, and everybody raves about them because they've had some fantastic hits, unbelievable hits. But what we don't talk about are, you know, in every collection of 10 in any given fund, like 7 don't make it. 3 or 4 die immediately, and then you have the walking wounded someplace, 3 or 4 others, and then there's a hit or 2. But the reason I tell the story is these are professional investors. These people work every single day at finding companies and then providing them money and providing them advice. These are professionals. These are the best of our venture investors. And what's their track record, right? Usually 1 in 10 choices. So the notion that, you know, and this happens all the time, and it's kind of tragic. So we choose a city, like someplace up in the Northeast, let's say, or in the Southwest, where, you know, a government has created a venture fund. They've opened up an incubator, and they got mentors. Now, those mentors are often like retired dentists, retired lawyers, people who never worked in a startup, okay? Venture funds are often, unfortunately, they're steered by cronies of the governor, okay, who, you know, may have made some money, may not have made some money. They're not professional investors. And, you know, then we run this big incubator, which I talked to you about. The statistics are appalling in terms of the non-success rate of local incubators. But it's like the cargo cult. Notwithstanding all the evidence that this does not work, we pour over $3 billion of public money through the federal budget into supporting this local ecosystem in community after community after community after community. In fact, you know, the reality is this is what happens, and it might be public policy, but we would never dare say it. You know, the really smart kid from Utica, who's got a really great idea, is going to Boston.
He's going to San Francisco. He's going to Silicon Valley.
He's not going to stop in Utica, notwithstanding the fact that Governor Cuomo built a new tech center, you know. No. Once we had airplanes and we had absolute free and complete communications in our economy, in our society, people go where the talent is, and they will gravitate to places where they're going to be more successful.
Yeah, we talked about this in a couple of earlier shows. John Tamney's a mutual friend, and John Tamney has been coined the phrase "talent tops taxes," and his point was that tax rates are not that important to where companies decide to locate their business if they're in an industry that's high tech and you want to be near other talented engineers or like-minded people. You don't care what the tax rate is. You just got to be where the action is. It's true in Silicon Valley. It's true in Hollywood, and you know it's true in a lot of other industries where you got to be near the other people like you.
Yes, for the most part, that's right. But you know, there are places like California, New York, and Illinois are going to test that hypothesis. Okay.
Yeah.
If these are high-earning people.
Well,
you will watch a collective walk out of those states.
So we've got a long list of things that you and I agree don't work particularly well. Business incubators, the idea that we're going to build garages and people are going to find their way into those to build companies, and also the mentor, the idea that there's some mentor, some disinterested person who can tell you how it's going to work. You point out that if you get a mentor, it sort of, you forget who's making the decision. And most mentors don't know as much as you do about your business, and they may have economic motives that are different from yours. So you got to be wary.
Very wary. I think in the book, I think the sentence survives that you should think about using mentors like Kleenex. You know, they are very useful for a period of time, and then you got to move to a clean mentor.
Okay, we're talking now about Carl's book, Burn the Business Plan. Let's talk about why we need to burn a business plan and why there might be another thing that entrepreneurs do that isn't a business plan but is very helpful.
Sure.
Called thinking.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's called thinking and planning.
Yeah.
But the business plan itself, let's take out that myth.
Right. Well, the title. Let me just start with the title. Okay. It came to me because I was giving a lecture at Georgetown in the Graduate School of Business, and a student, after I given my lecture, said, "You know, you're an investor. What part of the business plan is the one that's persuasive to you?" I said, "I never read business plans." "Are you writing them?" They said, "Yeah, of course they are," and I'll get to that in a second, because that's what's required in most courses to get your grade. You have to write a business plan, and I just said, "Burn them." Okay, burn your business plan. It makes no sense. And you could just see the professor and the students all gasp because they've been writing business plans. But, you know, if you look at this, the business plan as an idea was cooked up, I think, at Harvard about 1980. when we had students at Harvard wanting to become entrepreneurs, they were in the business school, there were no courses. And so overnight, the faculty had to sort of plug together two things. Venture capital was brand new. So we had the finance faculty with a whole new area of investment. And you had the strategic planning faculty that does strategy. And in any big company, when you do strategy, you write plans. So bang, there's the fusion. You write a plan about how you're going to start a business with the audience is going to be venture capitalists. So right from the beginning, the notion of why you want to do this on paper is because you want to convince an investor. Well, that's dandy, except the statistics tell us, that over 90% of businesses are self-funded by the individuals. Or put this on its head and really be more dramatic, we start about 500,000 businesses every year that employ somebody in the first year. Fewer than 4,000 of those businesses have a formal venture investor. So it's a fraction of startups ever get to see a venture investor. Yet we do this whole sort of formalized plan to get an idea in front of a venture investor. Now, one of the reasons I argue you shouldn't go through this, you have to get out there and just see it work. Because as a professor myself and a person who goes and now judges business plan competitions, I do this mostly to keep my blood boiling. There have been times that I've been in these competitions, so kids are out there and they tell you, about a brand new idea, brand spanking new idea that I've heard 10 times before. And there have been times when I wanted to basically jump up in an audience and say, you mean to say a professor told you this was worth wasting all this time on, right? One of my favorite, I don't think I tell it in the book, but I think it's in the book actually. I must have heard 8 times with such enthusiasm, you couldn't believe it, that some innovator had connected an electric frying pan to a phone app so that when you crack your eggs in the morning and turn this gizmo on, your phone will beep when the eggs are finished, right? I've seen that at least 8 times. Each time students present it like nobody else in all of history thought this up. And I'm sitting in there thinking, people have been cooking eggs on hot plates for like millennials, right? Thousands of years, right?
Yeah.
You need this? Okay. And one of the tragic things about this, Bill, is that we have something on the order of 3,000 to 6,000 professors. And you would think guys who are really interested in this, carefully interested in this, we'd have an inventory of ideas, all right? In medicine, one of the reasons we know we're making huge progress, like in cancer, is 40 years ago, professors of medicine actually created tumor registries. So we know on certain cancers how frequent it is, what the life cycle is of a cancer, where it metastasizes. We know that because people were so curious, they kept registries.
Yeah.
Nobody's at all curious about how many people are cooking up another idea about how to wire up a frying pan to a cell phone app, right? And if we had a registry, some professor, let's say at Indiana University, would say to Mary or Joe, this has been tried before, right? It's been tried before 37 times, it turns out, in the last year. You can try it again, but what's going to make yours more successful than the other 37 attempts, right?
You talk about business plans. Here's a business plan. I think there was at Harvard, and there was a kid in the 60s. We may not be part of an entrepreneurship class, but there was some sort of business plan, and he had this idea that I'm going to buy 50 jumbo jets, and I'm going to replace the U.S. Postal Service.
Yeah.
And he got a C-, I think, for the plan.
Yeah.
But he was a persistent guy. His name was Fred Smith, and he invented Federal Express. So at least there's one business plan. When you write it down, it sounds almost as preposterous as which gets us to a point where we know a lot about what doesn't work, but you've also pointed out in the book the sort of things that do work. And we're both big believers that lines of action, doing things are the way you really learn. And that entrepreneurship is about action, not about words. And you can only learn by doing. And so, as you pointed out, Kaufman pointed out, you have to start a company to learn how to start a company. And there's no real generalization. I think about businesses as being, they're all unique. You never step in the same river twice with the business. They're snowflakes. And so it's hard to bring rules, but you can learn with a specific, in a specific industry about what works and what doesn't. And I think a lot of the innovation comes out of the fact that people have been in an industry, they see, or in a company, they see what works, what doesn't work. They try this, they try that. They either take it to their boss or they go off. And that's where the innovation comes. It comes from some very specific thing that isn't being done or could be done. Right. And so it does work, and people do it. But you also point out that if you're going to do it, your chances of being successful of creating a really significant company is better if you go to college and major in engineering rather than entrepreneurship. Yes, absolutely. Because you've learned, first of all, professors of engineering, their daily job is developing innovations to solve real life problems. Yes. And, you know, it's the rare professor at MIT, for example, who doesn't have a company because in the course of working on a problem in his laboratory, or even on paper, if he's like a civil engineer, has figured out a better way to make steel trusses on bridges, or, you know, improve the sightlines on stadiums. And a company is born out of trying to solve a real problem. It's the same thing for people who are 40, have worked in a company for a long time. Look at all their advantages. They know the industry backward and forward. You know, they've seen big accounting systems in companies. I think one of the most important things is they've seen scale. Mm-hmm. Their imaginations are stretched, okay? You know, it's one of the things about Jeff Bezos that people don't quite understand. He was a Wall Street analyst, and you know what that means. It means he was on planes every day, and he was watching what he had seen there, just as an analyst, is he went to companies and saw massive warehouses, right? Now, I teach in a university, and if I said to any of my kids, I've done this in courses before, have any of you really seen a big company? Have you seen a huge factory? Have you seen a huge warehouse? Mm-hmm. I've never seen them. Yeah. Well, once you've seen one, you know, your imagination in terms of what scale could be, it's one of those things like when you see something once for a nanosecond, you can't think of the world different in the same old terms. You know, your life, your brain has been changed. And that's the advantage of folks, you know, who are 39 or 40 or 50. They know the sales ways in the industry. They know what's necessary. They have a much higher certainty that the innovation they've had, how to do the same thing better or cheaper or faster or some new twist on things that will make things all different, you know, is in their head. So we need to, unfortunately, we need to wrap up because we're covering things in a way that I think we could go for hours, but we don't have hours. I want to close. You've probably, I've had a lot of experience, but you've had even more in terms of assessing entrepreneurs. If somebody's 20 years old watching this, what advice would you give them? Oh, that's simple. If you're going to get a master's degree, don't do it in business, get it in engineering, one of the technical systems. Okay. Second piece I feel absolutely certain about is take a job in a big company. And take a job in a company that's moving into the future. It's hard to figure out what exactly that is, but, you know, a huge logistics company, you mentioned FedEx, great place to go to work. Mm-hmm. Systems at work, you get to see scale, you get to see the choreography of complexity, again, at scale. And it's a great place to learn loads and loads and loads of stuff. So if you have it in your you know, makeup, someday you want to work for yourself, someday you want to own a company. As I say in the book, there are some people who know they have to be boss. Mm-hmm. And they know even in big companies. It's the guy who sits there, watches the boss as he goes up or she goes up. They get a window on the decisions that are going on.
they go home at night and say, I would have made that decision differently. They're developing their confidence for when they get to the corner office. And the same thing goes on for entrepreneurs who've been in engineering companies and so forth. And they say, I would solve that problem differently. And the way I would solve it is universal. It would apply every place. I want to start a company to solve this idea.
Well, one advice I'd give them is if you're going to pick a college, you might pick Syracuse, and you might go to this guy who's an entrepreneurship professor named Carl Schramm, because
I don't teach entrepreneurship.
You don't teach? You don't teach it? That's great. What do you teach?
I don't believe it can be taught.
Okay.
I teach one of my favorite courses. I have two courses I like. They're great to me. Okay. Students do like them, but I don't want to be self-promoting. One of my courses is Introduction to Innovation, because my view is that's the trick, is to even understand what an innovation is. Anybody can take a great innovation, and if it's a great innovation, your chances of having a successful business are a bit higher, but we really don't understand innovation as much as we know the process of starting businesses. So there are all these black holes out there in knowledge, and I love probing this whole question of innovation. How do we innovate faster? There's a big concern in the United States. We're not innovating as fast as we used to, or the Chinese are innovating better than we do. But I think this is a critical issue. And of course, if students want to come to Syracuse University to take this course, great idea.
I now have an idea for part B for our conversation.
Okay.
Innovation. We're gonna talk about that, because I understand that your book is now on sale in China in the Beijing airport, and the Chinese are busily trying to figure out how to innovate, and maybe we'll talk about that next time. Carl,
that'd be great.
Carl, thank you. This has been really, really fascinating, and so thank you. Thanks for joining me on the Bill Walton Show, and you can subscribe to us on iTunes or YouTube or any of the major platforms. And Carl Schramm's book, Burn the Business Plan, What Great Entrepreneurs Really Do. If you're thinking about it or you want to know how it works, this is the book. Carl, next time.
Great. Super. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. Want more? Be sure to subscribe at thebillwaltonshow.com or on iTunes.